All right, friends, it's time to give you loyal listeners a discount on protein powder. You may or may not know, but I launched my very first protein powder 2 years ago. It's a grass-fed beef isolate with only 3 ingredients: grass-fed beef, either organic cacao or organic vanilla, and organic monk fruit. Now, if you don't want any of the added flavor and sweeteners, you can also just get unflavored. And no matter what flavor you choose, you're getting over 23 grams of protein per scoop, which is going to keep you full and satisfied between meals. I love starting my day with a Fab4 smoothie and breaking my fast with that much protein. It makes a serious difference in my cravings and blood sugar balance the rest of the day, and I've seen it with my clients as well. Now, I never thought I'd own a product company, but when I got pregnant with Sebastian, I realized the majority of protein powders were chemically extracted or enzymatically extracted, and I wanted to use heat and water only. I wanted minimal ingredients because we don't need those emulsifiers, fillers, or added vitamins, minerals, and probiotics. All of those additions increase the chances that it's not going to work for your body, whether it be bloating, digestion issues. I just wanted pure, clean protein to keep you full and satisfied so you could build the most delicious Fab4 smoothie. And I have to say, I'm pretty proud of the flavor. If you take a look at our reviews on Amazon, you'll see 5-star reviews for flavor. And that is key, because if you don't love your Fab4 smoothie and you don't love drinking your protein powder, you're not going to do it. It won't become a habit, and it's consistency that outpaces everything. So if you're here and you're listening and you want to give our protein powder a try, use the code podcast5 for $5 off your order. And let me know if you love it. My favorite ways to apply this protein powder is in my Fab4 smoothie, making freezer fudge, making chocolate milk, making hot chocolate, and throwing the unflavored into all my kids' baked goods. So let me know how you use it. Let me know if you love it, and share this podcast deal with your friends. Today's guest, Lara Adler, is an environmental toxins expert and educator. She's a certified holistic health coach, and she's deeply passionate about changing the landscape of disease through addressing toxic exposures. She's worked with thousands of practitioners in over 26 countries to help them understand the links between chemicals in our daily lives and chronic health conditions like metabolic disorders, thyroid disease, fertility, and even behavioral problems in children. She has a flagship course called Talking Toxins, where she gives health professionals like nutritionists, health coaches, RNs, and chiropractors a deep education on where these toxic exposures are happening and what we can do about it. I loved this episode so much. At the end, she goes through some free and easy ways to lower the toxic exposures in your home, especially endocrine disrupting chemicals. I hope you guys love this one. All right, Lara, welcome to the show. I'm so excited to have you. I slid into your DMs. I've been following you for a long time and just love everything that you're putting out there around endocrine disrupting chemicals. Before we started the podcast, I mentioned that it's a whole beast. I mean, and there's just, it obviously has allowed you to have a career as an environmental toxins expert. And I've interviewed Dr. Leo Trezande on the podcast, who's made it his life work as well to get this information out to people. So one, I just want to thank you for being the expert and for being here and sharing your knowledge with my community. It really means a lot. And for all you do on Instagram too.
Well, thank you for having me here. And, I am merely but one voice in this sort of shouting a group of us that are talking not only about endocrine disrupting chemicals specifically, but just chemicals in general in consumer products, in our food and in our water and the air that we breathe. And so it's something that we're all being affected by, whether we realize it or not. And so I'm happy to be here and to share with your audience.
I love it. Well, before we get into what are endocrine disrupting chemicals and what are these chemicals that are pervasive in our environment, can we start with your story? How did you become an environmental toxins expert, and what do you do every day?
The what I do every day part is not going to be nearly as fun as people think. I'll get to that one later. So, I kind of ended up here on accident. It wasn't something that I sought out. I never really found myself interested in the sciences in, middle school and high school, even in college. I was a business major in college. But I was always a food and nutrition nerd. Like that was what I did. Like I was the person that was baking like vegan banana chocolate chip coconut muffins in my college dorm communal kitchen, and then wouldn't share them with anyone because I'm like, no, I'm the only one that's vegan. You eat your own muffins. So I was the like farmers market person and would go visit farms and learn about how they were doing organic practices just because I was interested in it, but I didn't actually consider pursuing anything professionally in that space until I was like 8 years into another career where I was doing, I was working in the stock photography industry, totally unrelated. And I didn't like that work. And so I just kept kind of flexing this food and healthy lifestyle, nutrition, muscle personally. And then finally kind of worked my way into health coaching, which I thought, okay, well, maybe here's an opportunity for me to get out of corporate and do something that kind of scratches that itch that I have to talk about this kind of stuff all day. And so I did that. I was trying to figure it out and what does it mean to be a health coach and to consult and help people navigate healthy living. And most of the clients that I was seeing in those early days were coming to me sort of for general weight loss issues. And most of the clients that I worked with had success. They lost weight, they kept it off. And then I had a couple that were trying really hard. They did everything. They were super compliant. And the weight didn't budge for them. And they were frustrated and I was frustrated. And so I started digging into the literature around resistant weight loss and, kind of questioning what am I missing here? Because we looked at nutrition, we looked at exercise, we looked at stress, we looked at sleep, we looked at, all of these different things. And I didn't know anything about environmental toxins. And so I discovered this whole world of environmental health and environmental medicine. And I was just mind blown. It was so fascinating, but it was also infuriating because the more I was learning about the chemicals that are used in the manufacturing of consumer products, including chemicals that even at that time, this was close to 15 years ago, companies knew that these chemicals had negative health effects and they were still using them. And so that outrage about that really propelled me to dive into this space. At the same time that was happening, my sister-in-law was pregnant with my niece, and I was kind of going on this mission of researching babies' mattresses and toys, and was like, oh my God, what? It was just mind-blowing to me. And especially because at that point, I'd spent 15 years of my life reading all these books on nutrition and wellness and health and going back to school for health coaching. And this was never brought up.
Yeah.
And so I spent 2 years reading everything that I could and really immersing myself in the scientific literature. I was living in New York City at the time. And so I had the New York Academy of Sciences in my backyard. They had all kinds of conferences and symposiums on this topic. I had the Children's Mount Sinai Environmental Health Center that was also obviously doing work in this area. And I was just going and talking to these scientists that were presenting at these conferences and being like, am I understanding this right? As a lay person, in essence. And the more that I researched, the more I realized this is a massive education gap, because at the time, none of the people that I was surrounded by, the health coaches, the nutritionists, the acupuncturists, chiropractors, and then, over the years, certainly my scope of work has expanded to naturopathic doctors, medical doctors, physician's assistants, nurses, et cetera. But nobody in this space was talking about this topic or knew anything about it. And that to me felt like a huge mistake, a huge missed opportunity to help people. So that's sort of that's sort of the meandering path that I took to get into this space. And then there's some irony here. A couple of years ago, so I was vegetarian in middle school and then vegan in high school. Neither anymore. Didn't work out for me after almost 20 years. But I went back to, when you go back to your parents' house and you go through your old bedroom and you find your old random stuff that you didn't care enough about to take with you as you moved into adulthood. So my dad turned 80 a couple of years ago, and I went to his house, went home to celebrate. And I found this box of index cards from a report I wrote in high school. This would have been in 1992. So that's when we still actually wrote on an index.
I'm there with you. Sister.
Yeah, like we wrote on index cards as our like bibliography, because that's how we did it back in the day. And I just, I was like, I didn't even remember what it was. And the first card I randomly pulled out was a quote from some vegetarian book saying, one of the reasons why people are more attracted to a vegetarian diet is because of the increasing amount of toxic chemicals in the environment. And I got I got like weird goosebumps. I even just got them now, just telling you that story, because I'm like, wow, that was like 20 years before I started actively doing this work. And I was like, this is brand new information to me, but maybe it kind of wasn't.
It's amazing how passions and things really spark in people that when they go back to their childhood or their youth or the things they were really interested in, they might not have been, they might be dabbling in something but never really fully exploring it. They went to college for business. Yeah. Like, what was it? What were the pressures of, looking back on you in high school, like, did your dad do business or did your mom do business or who, like that?
Yeah, I mean, that's my dad. So I was just about to bring him up. So another sort of irony here in this story, I tell this to my students, is probably for the last 20, 25 years, my father, who still is not retired at 84, he works for a company that manufactures nonstick coatings.
Wow.
Yeah. And like, he's a consultant. He doesn't do anything. I mean, he works for himself as an independent consultant. And so like, the business gene I've had because I was filing his paperwork as his secretary since I was like 7. Right. Yeah. So like anybody who has a parent that works from home gets that.
Yep.
The suffering there. But I remember when I was in college still, sending my dad articles that I was reading about nonstick chemicals being toxic to birds, and I didn't know this at the time, but he was forwarding these articles to the president of the company, who he was, was on good terms with and friends with. And so I quickly, I'm laughing because I'm like, the irony. So, I mean, I think I was still in college, my dad, because he works for these cookware manufacturing companies that, utilize these nonstick coatings, he took me to a trade show in Chicago, which is the Gourmet Show, which is like every food-based.
I've been.
Yeah,
it's
okay.
Crazy.
So,
it's a monstrosity.
It's a kitchen gadget heaven.
Yeah.
So I went to the Gourmet Show, and we went to the booth of this company that he worked for, and the president of the company. And I've known him since I was, he's known me since I was a little kid. And he knows that I've been forwarding all these articles over the years about like how toxic these chemicals are. And he pulls me aside and he's like, oh, I think you'll be really pleased that our new, generation of cookware is very environmentally friendly. And I was like, tell me more. And so he proceeds to hand me a copy of their magazine article that they published, the magazine. Yeah. Like they publish their own magazines.
Here's our marketing collateral.
Yeah, here's our marketing collateral / magazine. And he explained that the coating on their pans is so durable that it lasts much longer, and therefore the pans don't need to be replaced as frequently. And that in his mind was an environmentally friendly move. And I was like, okay, that's nice.
Like, we are missing the point.
Yeah, you are missing the point. And this was like, I was still in college or just out of college. So like, I'm sharing these things to like remind myself, like, this is maybe the path that I was on that I didn't realize at the time. But there are all these things that kind of how I ended up here. I'd like to say it's on accident, but maybe it wasn't. I don't really know.
Yeah.
But that's the story.
It is very ironic. And also, I think, interesting knowing your background that you still pursued it and was really excited and passionate about it. It shows that you have integrity and, that you're even though it was like your dad's industry that you're going up against it and saying like, this is maybe isn't the best for us. And this education needs to get out there. So that's what I think we're going to do today. If you're cool with it.
Yeah, I'm cool with it. Cool with it. And to answer your second question, because it's a long answer to your first question, what I do all day really depends on what's on my plate. Sometimes it's podcasts, sometimes it's reading, books or research or, going down any endless rabbit holes. Sometimes it's working on social media. Sometimes it's teaching. Sometimes it's putting together new classes or editing older classes, or sometimes it's all of the above.
I love it. Well, you're putting so much education and information out there for the lay people, as you once were and now are no longer, to take the toxins out of their life, to elevate their choices, to change the things that they're purchasing for their home. And you're making it really easy. And I appreciate that so much. And I want to transmit that information and that education through the airwaves today. Let's start with giving people the 101, or what are endocrine disrupting chemicals, and you can expand that into regular chemicals as well, so that people have an idea of what we're talking about today.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm actually going to take one step back before I get to endocrine disruption to kind of preface what do we mean when we say chemical and toxic chemical, because first of all, I think it's really important to acknowledge everything is a chemical. Right? Everything is a chemical. Air is made of chemicals. The water we drink are chemicals. The hormones that course through our bodies are chemicals. And so in this field of environmental health, we are not here to malign chemicals, and chemicals are not all bad. We are here to discuss the chemicals, natural or manufactured, man-made, that have or are suspected to have a negative impact on humans, wildlife, or the environment in general. So I always like to kind of start with that, because there's always some folks who in the back of their mind are going like, well, everything is a chemical. And I want to go, yes, you're right. Everything is a chemical. We are not talking about all chemicals. We're talking about specifically ones that can be harmful or have the potential, or that we know are harmful. And endocrine disrupting chemicals certainly fall into that class, and in some pretty unique ways. So endocrine disrupting chemicals are merely chemicals. Or substances, chemicals, natural or synthetic, that have the ability to interfere with the normal, natural function of hormones in our body. So they can block or mimic hormones that we have from, docking in our hormone receptors that turn on, some message in a cell to go do a thing or don't do a thing. They can suppress the production of other hormones. They can really just interfere with our hormones. They can interfere with the way our hormones are metabolized. So at pretty much every kind of point along the journey, there are these chemicals, and it's a very broad, large class. So to date, there's been, I think the figure is about 1,000 chemicals that have been identified as endocrine disruptors. My hunch is that figure will grow exponentially as we do more research into chemicals, because historically we just don't have a lot of data, because our federal regulatory system hasn't required us to do testing. So we have a huge data gap. And so we're still learning about this stuff in real time, all the time.
Wow. So has there been any regulation change in regards to endocrine disrupting chemicals or chemical testing in general?
Not really. And so part of the reason is because we don't regulate chemicals based on their mechanism of action. We regulate one chemical at a time. So we're never going to, my hope is that we would regulate chemicals by class instead of as individual chemicals. So for example, there is a discussion about PFAS chemicals. These are these per and polyfluoroalkyl substances that are found in our everyday lives. They're found in our nonstick cookware, in our stain resistant carpeting treatments and couch treatments. They're in our outdoor gear, our raincoats and our backpacks and our tents, anything that's waterproof. And, they're found as contaminants in our drinking water. They're used in firefighting foams. And these are very endocrine disrupting. They're also highly persistent. They don't break down. And so there are nonprofit organizations around the country that are petitioning to say, let's ban or restrict this chemical as a class, because there's over 4,000 chemicals in this family. And so it doesn't make sense, and it's certainly not efficient, to look at one chemical molecule at a time when we know that most of the molecules in that family behave similarly, right? And so that's the same with endocrine disrupting chemicals. It's a giant class that spans, hundreds of different industries, thousands of different applications. And so what we do instead from a regulatory standpoint is we look at one chemical in one instance. So for example, we no longer use bisphenol A or BPA in baby bottles, right? That was a decision that was made in, I think, 2011. I think it was around 2011 to ban the use of BPA in baby bottles. Well, first of all, BPA is just one chemical in a family of
BPS.
chemicals.
Pick a new one.
So yes, and so these BPA-free plastics very well may contain BPS or BPF, and research into those sort of newer replacements, these are referred to as regrettable substitutions, research into those chemicals have found them to be just as bad, if not worse, than the chemical they were trying to replace. So it becomes this like regulatory whack-a-mole, right, where you whack one down and three more pop up in its place. And historically, we've just seen that happen so many times. We've seen it happen in PFAS chemicals. They used to be the ones that used to be used for the manufacture of these nonstick coatings were referred to as C8 chemicals, 8 for the number of carbon bonds. And the more carbon bonds something has, the harder it is to break down. That's why they're so persistent. And so the two primary chemicals, PFOA and PFOS, that were used in nonstick coatings, and those were phased out of use in 2008. But I have so much to say on this. The EPA is only now looking to start setting limits for those two chemicals in our drinking water. And I'm like, bros, like they're still out there. They're still in the environment because they don't degrade, but they're not actively being used, at least within the context of other PFAS chemicals have been replaced. But what did they replace them with? C6 chemicals. So fluorinated compounds that just have 6 carbon bonds, not 8. So they're just slightly harder to break down, but they still don't really break down. So it's again, these are referred to as regrettable substitutions. And it's a result of the way that we approach our regulation of chemicals. So there is no movement here in the United States to even examine endocrine disrupting chemicals as a class, let alone regulate them. The European Union is taking some steps in that direction of saying, let's look at endocrine disrupting chemicals as a whole, but it's kind of still in its infancy. And then there's still a lot of debate about whether or not they're doing it right. So at least they're a couple steps ahead of us.
No, but it's what makes your information and your job so important for everyone who is interested in taking care of their health, because you have all this information and you have this data, and you're not just going to be sold on marketing, but instead you're going to say, look, you have the power. If they're not going to do it for you, you have the power to do it in your own home with your own family. And these are like the major things that you can start removing from your life.
Yeah. And I think that's a yes. And because I've become far more aware over the last few years and have taken major issue with this notion that it's the consumer's responsibility to avoid this stuff. That is not, we do not need, I wish I didn't have to have this conversation. Are you kidding?
Right.
Like it should not be up to an individual to have to jump through 1,000 hoops, spend all this time learning about what to do to just minimize chemicals in their daily lives. That is the job of government regulation. And so to me, it's a yes. And like, yes, certainly we want to take all the actions that we can, because we're not being protected from a regulatory standpoint. And the hope is that the individual actions that we take will help send strong messages to manufacturers, to industry, to start making changes. And certainly that's happened, right? We've seen that over the last decade where we have, whether it's these sort of placating, we're going to take BPA out of the bottles, don't worry, we got you, and then they're just swapping it with BPS, or where you've got, large big box stores like Costco and Walmart and Target and CVS and Walgreens that are all committing to phase out some of these more toxic chemicals out of their brand name products as a starting point. And so that's happened as consumers have demanded it. So we do have this incredible power in the marketplace to sort of flex these muscles of voting with your dollars. Really, it's that. And I don't think that it's fair to put all of it on us. The same issue is mirrored in the recycling and climate conversation, where the plastic manufacturers of, Coca-Cola and Pepsi are all like, yeah, like we took 10% of plastic out of our bottle caps, or like, get people to say no to drinking straws because we want to save the turtles. Well, yes, but let's not put this on the consumer because it's industry that's responsible for the vast majority of plastic pollution. So it's a yes and there's so many yes ands in this space. And so I just wanted to mention that part. So yes, we want to do everything we can, and we want to pressure our representatives,
definitely,
and our local representatives to take on these issues and to sort of take them up the chain and push for better regulation.
You make such a good point, and I'm glad you made it, because it's a luxury to be able to care.
Yes.
It's a luxury to have the time to educate ourselves in this space.
Yep.
And
it's a privilege. It's absolutely a privilege. Yeah.
To have like the money to decide you're going to use a specific type of water filter, for example, but it's just really unfair that people aren't safe.
Yeah. And the unfortunate and hard reality of this conversation is that the people that are most disproportionately exposed to environmental chemicals, which are Black, brown, and low-income communities, have the least access, the least resources, not only for safer alternatives, if it's a problem we can shop our way out of, and certainly air pollution is not a problem we can shop our way out of.
Right.
But they have the least access to healthcare. And so this is where we see, certain populations that are being disproportionately burdened with exposure, dealing with more chronic health issues as a result, and have the least access to resources. So this is part of the very frustrating and not okay dynamic of this conversation. And so, I'm acutely aware that there is a tremendous amount of privilege for folks who do want to go and, get the expensive multi-stage water filtration system or whole house system, when most people can't afford that, right? Most people at most maybe can afford a Brita. And so this is where we really need to push for infrastructure change and better regulation and monitoring. There's 77 million Americans who are drinking tap water that's in violation of the Safe Drinking Water Act. And just because a chemical is regulated, and there's not that many of them, and that's just in the drinking water, it doesn't mean that there's any recourse when water municipalities exceed the standards. And so it's just we could go in 1,000 different directions on this conversation. I know we want to stick to endocrine disruption, but I just wanted to provide scale for folks, because I think it's so important.
It is so important. And I would say of the 77 million Americans, 500,000 of them, 1 million, 2 million, even know that that's a problem for them.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Oh,
I just
getting really fired up over here.
This is, remember how I said it was outrage that really propelled me into this space. I get very spicy about this. I just moved recently from the Pacific Northwest in Portland, Oregon, where the water is not amazing, but it's actually relative to other places in the country pretty good. And I moved to New Mexico, and my most recent water test, which I did right when I arrived, lands me in the 3rd percentile, which means 97% of people have better water, because we have uranium and arsenic in the water. And, it's bad. And New Mexico is the 2nd poorest state in the country. So we don't have the infrastructure to get these contaminants out of the water. And they're not added, like arsenic and uranium are natural elements, but they're highly toxic and we shouldn't be drinking them in our water.
Right. Can you talk about toxicity? Because you just mentioned toxic, and I think it makes a point that I'd like for you to expand on as the expert. I hear people saying the quantity, the dose.
Oh, the dose makes the poison. Yes. Yes.
And there's a lot of like people on Instagram who are getting a lot of press around this being like, that's not a problem. This isn't a problem. It's the dose. But how do we know? Like, so what do we know?
Yeah. Yeah. So like a lot of things, it's a yes and. Okay. So the dose makes the poison is the sort of foundation of toxicology. It's an adage that was, essentially a concept that was essentially developed by some guy in the 15th century. And that's like, we just kind of hung our hat on that and was like, that's it. Even though the world has evolved a lot since then. And so basically the dose makes the poison is this concept that says that if we are exposed, basically it says like everything can be a poison. It's the dose that matters. And so even water can kill you if you have too much, right? It can dilute your salts and your electrolytes in your body enough to the point where like it can cause you to die. That's happened. And so, yes, there are people that make these statements that yes, even water can kill you if you have too much. And what they're referring to is this concept of the dose makes the poison, which basically says if you're exposed to a large amount of something, it's always going to be worse than if you're exposed to a small amount of something. Small things don't matter. It's the dose that matters, right? The dose being higher. And so the reason why I said it's a yes and is because absolutely, without question, most exposures follow that concept. They follow that what's called a linear dose response curve, where as the dose goes up, the response is linear, it's straight, it's predictable. It's either always going up or always going down, period. Doesn't change. Right. So most things abide by that. The thing that does not abide by that are endocrine disrupting chemicals. They completely explode this quote unquote fact that all things follow the dose makes the poison. And what I find fascinating, and I'll explain why, but like what I find fascinating about this is that if you talk to most endocrinologists and pharmacologists, they're like, yeah, of course, endocrine disrupt, like, of course, yeah, because that's how like the human body works. Yeah. And then you talk to a toxicologist and they're like, no, that's not real. I mean, not all, again, I'm making broad generalizations. There's always going to be exceptions in these groups. And the problem with that disconnect is that all of our regulatory decisions, all the stuff we just talked about, are based on toxicological research that is not even examining these endpoints of endocrine disruption in the defining of something or declaring of something as being toxic. So when it comes to our hormones, our hormones are messengers, they're communication messengers in our body. And the way that I like to say it is that they communicate in whispers. They're very quiet, right? They're just really tiny levels. So the amounts of hormones that's coursing through our bodies that are responsible for fertility and making a human being, or menopause, or hunger, or sleep, whatever. It's not just sex hormones. The amounts that's coursing through our bodies is so small. So it would be like the equivalent of like a parts per billion or even parts per trillion. So extraordinarily small levels. And we know that those very small fluctuations can lead to, talk to somebody who's going through menopause or has a teenager going through puberty, and like those are pretty significant. So pretty significant biological changes. And so we already know that small levels of hormones in the human body can have a large effect. They're bioactive at very, very low levels. That is how physiology works. When we have endocrine disrupting chemicals that mimic or block hormones, they masquerade as hormones in the body, and we are exposed to them at extraordinarily low levels, at the volume or frequency that our bodies are naturally attuned to, we have a problem. And that is why the dose in this example does not always make the poison. And so what we see with endocrine disruption is what are called non-monotonic dose response curves. So I mentioned earlier, a monotonic dose response is like, it's a straight line that goes up or down. The response goes up, the dose goes up, and the response either goes up or down. It's predictable. When we look at endocrine disrupting chemicals, we often see what are called non-monotonic or non-linear dose responses. So as the dose increases, the response changes in a non-linear way. So maybe it's a U shape or an upside down U shape or like a sine wave, where at certain levels, the response is high and then it goes low and then it goes high again. And so it's not predictable. And the problem here, bringing it back to toxicology, is that when toxicology studies are done, they start, because again, they're leaning on this premise of the dose makes the poison, large exposures are really the worst. And so they do rodent studies, because we don't test chemicals on people. Mm-hmm. And they're dosing thousands of times higher than what we would expect to, because they're trying to see like, what would happen worst case scenario? Like, let's just really high level, just so we can trigger a response. And then what we'll do is we'll work our way backwards, right, to lower and lower levels of exposure. And they're looking for like 2 points. They're looking for the low L and the no L. And the low L is the lowest observed adverse effect level. And put a thumbtack in adverse effect, because I'm going to come back to that. Okay. So that's the lowest dose that they're like, okay, we're still seeing an adverse effect here. We're seeing some bad stuff, maybe like a tumor, right? Okay. Then they go a little bit lower and they go, let's test a little lower, and until we find nothing. No adverse effect. That's the no L. Yeah. And then they stop testing. And they factor in, like, let's go a little bit lower just to factor in a margin of error and, for like safety. Right. And then they get this, what they determine to be the safe dose. But that safe dose is almost never tested directly. And then doses lower than that are never tested. And yet it is those lower levels of exposures that are never tested that are actually reflective of real human exposures in the environment.
It's like they're just expecting the linear curve and they're not doing the homework.
Exactly. They're expecting a linear curve. And like I said, for a lot of things, sure, that's the case. Like that would be an accurate a prediction. That would be the line would continue to be straight. But endocrine disrupting chemicals, like I said, they don't behave that way. And when you get into the frequency, right, this volume that our hormones are naturally attuned to, that our bodies are attuned to, everything outside of that becomes white noise, right? Like we only have so many estrogen receptors in our body. And so once those are all filled up, more is not going to affect our hormone system. It might affect other systems, like it can still be toxic, but the parking spots are all filled, right? And so when we're looking at toxicology, again, I'm going to go back to that adverse effects. They're looking for like gross histological changes. They're looking for tumors, changes in organ weight, death, right? Yeah. Those are the endpoints that they're considering for defining whether or not something is toxic. But if we look, they're not looking at slight fluctuations in hormones that might lead to cancer or an increased risk of cancer. They're not looking for slight fluctuations in hormones that might lead to, adrenal issues or digestive issues or any other kind of, fertility issues. They're not looking at those. Right. But talk to somebody who is dealing with those issues, and those are certainly adverse experiences in their lives. Right. And so there's just this disconnect. And again, what's fascinating to me is that pharmacology fundamentally understands this. Pharmacology and endocrinology are sister disciplines. They're literally just examining things on different ends of the spectrum. So pharmacology is at the low end, toxicology is at the high end, but they don't talk to each other.
Right.
It's wild to me.
We need them to for our health, to manage these adverse effects that we are having that they're not seeing in animal and rodent studies that could be avoided if we could get rid of classes at a time out of
Yeah,
our environment.
I'll actually give you a real example of this in action. So a couple of years ago, this was a really unusual study. Like I said earlier, we don't test chemicals on people because it's not ethical, except one research group actually got ethics approval. They got approval to do a study looking at testing BPA exposures at the level that the EPA says is currently safe, which is 50, I think it's 50 micrograms per deciliter per day. I think that's the correct measurement.
Yeah.
And they say, okay, 50 micrograms is okay. We consider that safe. And so this research team was like, okay, let's test it. Let's see.
Yeah.
Let's get it's not violating any ethics code because you're telling us it's safe.
Yeah.
So let's test it. And so they tested this and they found that like one single exposure in human beings, these were men, it was a small study, so would have to be replicated, but led to changes in their glucose response that are reflective of insulin resistance in one exposure in one day. And so that's not an endpoint that ever would be considered by toxicologists because it's just like not what they're looking at. But that has massive implications. Right. If that's repeated and we say, oh, okay, well, this level that we're getting that's quote unquote safe or this top level, and certainly some people might be getting more. So if you're working in an occupational setting with materials that contain bisphenols, whether it's a canning factory or a cashier handling cash register receipts all day for 8 hours a day, that exposure might be higher. But like we are all getting exposed to BPA. 93% of people have been found, the CDC has found metabolites of bisphenols in 93% of the population. And that was from data from like 8 years ago. Yeah. So it's possible that it's higher at this point. So this is why I think this is so concerning and why we, as individuals, we need to do what we can while also pressuring our, representatives to kind of take industry to task and work harder on better regulating these compounds.
Right. Start making some sweeping changes and quick.
Yeah. And what's nice about, and this certainly does not apply to all endocrine disruptors, but many of the ones that we're most commonly exposed to, like the bisphenols, BPA, BPS, BPF, phthalates, which are found in thousands of different products, even our organophosphate pesticides, many of which, in addition to being carcinogenic and neurotoxic, can also be endocrine disrupting. And that's the problem here, classification-wise, is that a single chemical can have so many different endpoints that it can be a neurotoxin and an obesogen and an endocrine disrupting chemical all at the same time. But the good news is that all of those chemicals are non-persistent. They don't build up in the body. They're showing up consistently in the human population through this biomonitoring studies because we're taking them in faster than we can get rid of them. Wow. So BPA and phthalates and certainly probably most of the organophosphate pesticides, they have a really short half-life in the body. So that means that our bodies can metabolize them and pee them out. It doesn't mean that they're not problematic in the short time that they're in the body. They are, right? But we can get rid of them. So, heavy metals, things like that, we build up in our bodies. Persistent chemicals like PFAS, found in 99.99% of people tested, all of us. Yeah. Those are hard to get rid of because they stick in our bodies. They're persistent. But phthalates and bisphenols and these pesticides, they're not. So we know that by practicing avoidance behaviors, that means reducing what's coming in, we can actually significantly lower the amount of those chemicals in our bodies in just a short window of time. And I'm talking like a couple of days. And there have been a number of intervention studies that have demonstrated this.
It's silver lining. It sounds like we have a two-pronged approach. One is really, and we won't touch on heavy metals today. We don't need to go there, but the PFAS, really having a major avoidance of the PFAS, knowing that those are persistent and those are harder to get rid of and harder to break down really in the body. but then to have an action plan for these toxic chemicals that then are non-persistent, that we can get out of our system. I think the doer in me, the person who likes to check things off the checklist, I'm like, all right, let's check everything on the non-persistent off. Let's swap things out. Let's pick better things. So I never have to think about them as often, and then really make the swap for the long-term effects, or the long persistent chemicals as well. So let's take them in two groups if we can. And let's talk about the bad guys first, the PFAS that stick around a long time. If you were to go through someone's home or their environment, what are the major culprits or bad, the bad apples in the bunch that are causing this, they're found? You get it.
Yeah. So this specific class is actually harder to deal with and to address because it's in our carpeting.
Yeah.
Right. And how are we going to eliminate that? Well, we have to rip up our carpeting, right? So that's a huge investment in resources and time that most people aren't going to want to do. They're in our furniture. If we have if our couch has stain resistant treatments and Scotchgard treatments, if our clothes have these treatments, our raincoats, our kids, leather boots, and we want to get them waterproof. So we get our little Scotchgard leatherproof, waterproofing spray. Those are PFAS chemicals.
Yeah.
They're designed to repel water and grease. They're in our food packaging. There have been moves. The FDA is finally kind of going, okay, well, maybe we should look at food packaging and maybe this shouldn't be permitted. I mean, it'll probably be years before we get any real progress on this, but they just made this announcement just within the last couple of days that this is something that they're going to be at least looking at, right? Who knows what they'll decide. But these are not places that are easy for people to make changes around. So I typically start the recommendation process with what are the things that are free and easy, regardless of whether there's persistence or non-persistence. Because if we only look through the lens of persistence and non-persistence, we're going to run into these roadblocks where it's like, well, what am I supposed to do?
I can't replace my couch right now. Yeah.
Right?
So I just going to feel bad looking at my couch every day.
Right. And it's not in the cards for the vast majority of people to just go, oh, well, I'm going to go buy a new couch that doesn't have these chemicals. Right. So, there's not a lot that we can do there's not too much we can do. We can increase hand washing. We can increase wet dusting around our homes, which is, using either literally a wet cloth or a microfiber cloth that we then either launder or throw away. Prefer the laundering type so that we're not just filling our landfills with non-woven, non-biodegradable materials. But that helps trap some of these chemicals that migrate out of the material into our house dust. And so that sort of falls into this category of free and easy, which is it doesn't cost anything to wet dust. The point is that we want to capture the dust and get rid of it. We don't want to just use a feather duster to move stuff around because it literally just moves stuff around. Right. So that you can't see it. And then after a while it settles again and you're like, wow, it got dusty in here. And I'm like, it's the same dust from before plus new dust. So we want to get rid of it. But that's something that anybody can do. It's accessible to everybody. It's not fun. Nobody likes to clean, including myself. And so, I don't want to tell people everybody go clean your houses like crazy, but it is one of the ways that we can reduce exposures to both persistent and non-persistent chemicals. So looking through that lens of what's free and what's easy in terms of reducing exposures in the home for you who's a doer and everybody else who's a doer is open your windows. It doesn't matter if I lived in New York City, open your windows. Unless you're living in the middle of a forest fire or some chemical explosion where or you're living in a place that air is extremely toxic, or you're living in an agricultural area where people are actively spraying pesticides, then don't open your windows. Yeah. But find times when they're not doing those things and open your windows. And the reason why we want to do that is because so many of the chemicals that kind of piggyback into our homes on building materials, on your flooring, on your carpeting, on the paint on your walls, on your furniture, the things that are harder to change, those chemicals off gas. And they get trapped in our homes because we don't open our windows, and our homes are built very energy efficient. Since the 80s, we've been doing that. And the downside, while we're saving money on like heating and cooling costs, is that we don't have as much fresh air in our homes. And those chemicals that we're bringing in more and more all the time don't have a way to escape. Mm-hmm. And so opening your windows is a great way to just lower the level of pollutants in your indoor air. Mm-hmm. EPA has stated that indoor air can be 2 to 5 times worse than outdoor air, all the way up to 1,000 times worse. If you're like painting a room in your house, suddenly the air pollution levels are 1,000 times worse than what you'll see outside. And the kicker is there are federal regulations in place for air pollution outside, not inside. So there's no one regulating the air quality inside your home. There are federal agencies. Whether they're doing a good job is another question, but they exist. There are regulations that exist. You can't have that much of this chemical in the air, or you have the factory responsible is going to have to do something about it. Yeah. And so opening our windows is a great way to just get that air exchange going. Stop buying scented candles, air fresheners, plug-ins, reed diffusers, all of those home fragrances, right? Those are a big part of why your indoor air is polluted, because those products, most of them contain phthalates, which are those endocrine disrupting chemicals we talked about earlier. They're same as BPA. Phthalates, metabolites, phthalates, I think are measured in 98% of people. So like they're ubiquitous. They have a really short half-life in the body. So they get metabolized, they break down and get metabolized very quickly. But we want to get rid of all those home fragrances. Somebody just messaged me on Instagram the other day and was like, oh, is this Airwick natural product problematic? Like it's giving me like hives.
Then yes, obviously.
But it says it's phthalate free. And I'm like, okay, well, phthalates are just one chemical. There are hundreds of other chemicals that are used in those products. Phthalates aren't the only problem in there. So even if you have something that's phthalate free, it has all of these other respiratory irritants, VOCs, benzenes, toluenes, all of these compounds that are toxic. And even if it's not like with the scented candles, even if it's not lit, if you can smell it, those molecules are moving into your body and they're just in the air in your home. I mentioned house dust earlier. There was a meta-analysis which is a study of studies, looking at house dust studies from around the world. Incredibly dry, boring, but I think important research. And they found phthalates in 100% of house dust samples. Why? Because everybody has scented products. Right. So not buying them goes a long way. If you want your house to smell nice, start by opening the windows. Then if you need to, get like an essential oil diffuser and go, cautious on those. I know people tend to go overboard, and just because it's natural doesn't mean it's safe. It can still be an irritant for a lot of people. So those are the super easy things. And then it's like, take off your shoes when you come inside so that you're not tracking in pesticides and heavy metals. It's not just dog poop that we're worried about, especially if we have carpets that we can't get rid of, because those carpets become a sink and they hold all these contaminants. So we want to just take off your shoes when you come in the door and wear socks or wear slippers. Really easy. And then from there, we're starting to get more proactive. So this is where we're like prioritizing organic food as much as somebody's able to, if they're able to. As we said earlier, there are some populations, they don't have access to any organic food, let alone any fruits and vegetables, right? Because they're in a food desert. And so any fruit and vegetable is better than no fruits and vegetables. Organic fruits and vegetables are better than regular vegetables. So it's like it's a spectrum. But I was, if the only food that somebody can get is non-organic, still eat the vegetables. We still need those nutrients for our bodies to actually help break down and detoxify these compounds and other compounds. So But yeah, if you can prioritize organic, do that. There have been multiple studies looking at both adults and children that have found that by switching from a conventional diet to a mostly organic diet, not even 100%, you can drop the circulating levels of pesticides by 80 to 90% in 3 to 5 days.
You know how many people are getting rid of their clothing budget right now and moving things around to make that happen for their kids? Like, I'll tell you,
I think it's,
yeah. Some people don't do it for themselves. And the minute you have a child, you're like, yeah, no, I don't need to get this done or that done. Or I am moving things around. It's like, where are your priorities? And if you're here and you're listening to this, health and wellness probably resonates with you. Like, that right there is payoff for me. Like, I hear that number and I go, that's it. Like, I need to check in with Chris. I mean, we try our best to do that.
Yeah, and we do our best.
But like, check in with my husband and be like, okay, like, if you're buying the groceries, I also want you to know this stat, because education is motivating for me, and stats and science. Like, that's what's going to get me to change. And I know it inspires a lot of other people too.
Well, and I think there's a lot of people that need to see that, and that are maybe uncertain or questioning whether or not like these are a big deal, and whether or not this is actually, I mean, there are certainly people out there that think organic foods are a scam, right?
Yeah.
And that there's no difference. And that's just not what the data shows. It's just not. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of, probably thousands of studies linking low levels of pesticide exposures, not just from our food, but certainly primarily from our food, that are linked to so many different chronic health issues. And so if it's something that we can control and we have the ability to afford it, let's do that. And we just do our best, and it's not perfect. I eat out at restaurants. I guarantee you that the food in the kitchen is not organic in 99% of the restaurants that I go to. But like, I'm also a human being, and I like to
enjoy your life. Yeah.
I like to enjoy my life, and I don't always want to cook dinner.
Yes. And I think that needs to be 100% okay too. This is like, I know people say 80-20, whatever, 90-10. Like, for me, it's mostly, I don't want to stress out about the things happening outside of my house. I want to just, I want to take action in a big way in the places where I can. And that, if that means going wet dusting, opening our windows, putting a calendar alarm or a reminder on my Google calendar to like open the windows every Sunday, or just really enforcing that shoe policy. Chris is pretty good about the shoe policy. He runs a tight ship. So sometimes he's like, take your shoes off. I'm like, okay. But like, those are great tips for people that they can all start doing. Like you said, free and easy. Beyond that, I love big sweeping changes too, or things that can make a big difference. You've mentioned water a couple of times on this podcast. You mentioned food, water, and air, and we've touched on organic, but what can we do with our water?
Well, we can filter it. And this is such a big space. I mean, I can easily spend hours just talking on water. The tricky thing with water contamination is everybody's water contamination profile is different. So like I said earlier, I moved from Portland to New Mexico, and I had to retest my water because I know it's different. It's a totally different part of the country. The geology of the earth is different. So that's where the arsenic and the uranium is coming from. We don't have uranium deposits in the Pacific Northwest, not something to worry about.
Right.
And so I think the first step, there's two first steps. There's step 1 and then step 1B, 1A and 1B. So 1A is for people to understand what's in their water first. There is no perfect water filtration system, despite what influencers and marketing and water companies will tell you. There really isn't. And certainly the companies that are like, takes out everything. And I'm like, well, that's $500. And how many people can afford that? Yeah. Right. So it's not a good solution for everybody. And that's why you won't see me making a specific brand recommendation for filters, because I'm like, I don't know what filter you should get. What's in your water? Let's start from there. So people can look up, they can find basic information about their water by just Googling the words water quality report and then the city that they live in, like Springfield, Illinois, or whatever.
Yikes.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's probably not good water there. But and so you'll get your annual water quality report. You want to look for the most current year. Water municipalities are federally required to produce these reports annually. And what they're going to show you is where your water is from. Is it surface water? Is it groundwater? If it's surface water, you may have more pesticides if you're in an agricultural area, or more industrial chemicals if you're in an industrial area, urban area. If it's groundwater, you may have more heavy metals. You may have fluoride. You may have arsenic, right? You may have, it depends on the geology of the aquifer that the water is stored in. So many variables here. And so it's going to tell you where your water is from. It's going to tell you how it's treated. Do they add chlorine? Do they add fluoride? Do they add chloramine? What other disinfection chemicals? And then they're going to show you, here are the levels of the regulated contaminants. And there's about 90 that are regulated. And here's what our testing has shown compared to what like the federal guidelines should be. Now, the problem with that is they're typically, it depends on what the contaminant is, but sometimes they're spot tests. So some of these tests, they only have to run once a year or once every 3 or 4 years. So you're like, well, how accurate is that really? Yeah. Right. And so, and just because, just to make it a little bit trickier, when you're looking at a water quality report and you see like what are called the MCL and the MCLG, MCL is the maximum contaminant level. That's the maximum amount that's allowed in the drinking water. And then there's the MCLG, which is the goal. The goal is typically less. So right. Like, here's the maximum allowed, but like, here's our goal. Our goal might be 0 or 0.1 or whatever. Those are not health standards. They're not health and safety standards. Those are negotiations between public health officials and what the federal government feels that water municipalities can afford to meet. Ugh. Right? So they're not health standards, and people need to know that. And so there are, just because you're all within you're not exceeding any, Safe Drinking Water Act contaminant levels, doesn't necessarily mean that your water is okay to drink. Right. From a long-term safety perspective. And so again, look up your water quality report, gives you basic information. Beyond that, you can do testing. There's companies like TapScore, which is my personal favorite company to test, because they give you a more accurate health standard, and then in comparison to like the federal level. So they're like, here's what the federal says is safe. Here's what we say is safe based on all of the data that we've looked at. And then what are other cities, states, or countries that have set stricter regulations than what we have for health reasons. So their testing data is legit. And that's what my water is in the 3rd percentile in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So 97% of people have water that's better than me because of the type of contaminants. And so test first, know what you're dealing with. And then from that test, you'll be able to find out, TapScore will give you some recommendations. Not all companies do that, they do, of what type of filter takes out those contaminants, because every filter takes out every contaminant. PFAS are, they're not super hard to get rid of, but it depends, like your Brita filter can't take PFAS out. Right. Right. And so it depends. People always say, what's the best filter I should get? And I'm going, I don't know. It depends. What do you got? What are you dealing with? Right.
So when you look at charcoal filters, and then you look at something like a Berkey, which is, I guess you'd be
it's
like
gravity fed. I can't remember what the exact tech term is for the technology, but it's just like a very tight, porous material.
Right. And then you have like a reverse osmosis type of a water filter. Are any of those, like, if you could generalize, like, would a reverse osmosis filter take everything out of the water? Or are there things that get through an RO? Yeah. So a reverse osmosis is the most effective at taking out the most number of contaminants. So it'll get rid of most of everything. There's 2 problems with reverse osmosis, in my opinion. One is that it removes the beneficial minerals that we're looking for in our water. We are getting minerals from our food, but not as much as we used to because of soil depletion issues, because of over farming and over
really sucking
tilling
on.
and
yes, over-tilling and not doing regenerative farming practices, which actually, is intended to rebuild, the beneficial nutrients in the soil. And so our food isn't as mineral rich as it used to be. So I think the minerals in our water is important. You can skirt that problem by remineralizing your water after RO. But the bigger problem for me is that RO is wasteful. So you use, between 1 to 5, you lose like I'm trying to remember basically for every gallon of drinkable water, of actual potable water, you're wasting a gallon or 2 gallons or sometimes even 3 gallons of reverse osmosis water. It's just how the technology works. So there's wastewater. Some systems are able to get that down to about a third. So if you have a gallon of water, you're wasting a third of it going down the drain. I don't think that's a great solution for everybody. We are moving into an era where water scarcity is becoming a bigger problem. Climate change is causing drought in more places. I don't think that making a blanket recommendation that everybody go out and get RO water, where we're wasting all this water, is a responsible recommendation. So it is a worst case scenario. Like if your water is really, really bad and you have contaminants that can only be removed by RO, get an RO.
Got it.
Right?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
But otherwise, don't.
Yeah.
Right. If you have a filter that can remove, if you have like a multi-stage 3 or 4 stage under sink filter that's not RO, that takes out everything that you have, great. If you happen to live in a city or a place where the water's actually pretty good, maybe all you need is a Brita.
Right.
Right. Like you don't need to, this is why I don't like making recommendations, because I'm like, I don't know, A, what you're dealing with, or B, what you can afford. And it's not fair.
Right.
For me to make a recommendation for a $300 or $400 filter for somebody who's like, yeah, that's my whole food budget for the month. I can't do that.
Right. Start where you're at. Test
Yes.
your water, tap score. Is there any way that tap score, just because I like data, like say, do you send your sample into tap score and then they send you back a report? And would there be a way for you to say, get a Brita, something that like fits your family budget, test your water, and then test your Brita filtered version of your water to get an idea?
They actually offer, I think they have some kind of discount if you do 2 tests at once. So you're testing your water and then you test your filtered water to make sure that it's doing what it actually says it's supposed to do. Yeah. So if you have the money to do that, certainly I think that's a great idea. I'm actually going to be doing that myself because I actually have a countertop RO system. It's not my favorite. I was sent it by the company and then I just was like, hey, let me take this to New Mexico. And I'm glad that I've been using it because
you got some low quality water there.
Yeah. And then because the water's so bad. And so I'm grateful that I have it and I've been using it, but it's cumbersome and annoying. And it takes me an hour to filter enough water for 2 gallons. Like it takes an hour for that.
You're drinking it faster than you're using it.
Yeah. I mean, it feels like that because I put it in my humidifiers. I put it in the cat dish, and so I'm like, well, I feel like I'm doing this all day. So I don't love it, but yes. And TapScore has tons of information on their website. I just love them as a company. I'm an affiliate for them, but you don't have to go through me.
I'll put your affiliate in the show.
Okay, great.
Links. Like, honestly, I just appreciate your time so much. And like, this is, like I said, it's a behemoth. It's a whole, you have a whole career in it, and you could talk for hours and hours on this podcast. We probably could have done a podcast on water, one on like,
100%. I mean, I have a course on water that's 3 hours and that's still not everything. So I literally could talk about these things 4 hours and have.
Yeah, good. Well, we'll definitely have to have you back. I know we've taken up so much of your time. Major takeaways from today: wet dusting, opening your windows, getting rid of home fragrances, wearing slippers and taking your shoes off, trying to buy organic food if you can, getting your water tested at TapScore, getting out there with your government officials, making some noise, trying to change this for everyone else so that we can all have access to the safety of a world with lower pervasive endocrine disrupting and toxic chemicals.
Absolutely.
Lara, you are beating the drum hard. I freaking love you. This has been really this is really important work. I hate to see cancer rates and, endocrine disrupting chemicals being obesogens, metabolic. I mean, in my world, when I think about insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, and you did this for a while, the health coaching world, people deal with chronic lifestyle diseases and they're at their wit's end. They're trying their best to do everything right and it's not working. And, we have to look at their whole world, including their environment and what chemicals exist there.
Yeah. And I think what's, like we said earlier about looking for the silver lining, which, as dark and depressing and Debbie Downer as this topic can be, I am an optimist. And I like to also say, I need to I've been saying this for 2 years, but I need to get a t-shirt printed that says I can ruin anything because I can. I can make anything that anybody's doing anywhere sad. Not that that's my intention, but it's a skill that I have. It's my party trick is I can ruin anything. Anyway, but I am an optimist. And I think that what is really encouraging is, one, to see dialogue about this topic pushed way further into sort of public awareness, into news media. We have more and more doctors that are talking about this, more and more medical professionals. It's still a massive education gap. It's not included in medical school curriculum. For the most part, there are some programs that talk about this, not many. And, I think that when we see more conventionally trained medical doctors that are recognizing how significant of an issue it is, and all working to get this information out there, I think it bodes well for all of us. And we still have a lot longer to go. We have a lot more work to do, but it is inspiring to see more and more awareness. I've been doing teaching now for a decade. And when I first got started, I swear I felt like I was the only one. And now there's this giant family of people that are very grounded in the scientific research and that are very passionate about sharing this information and getting it out there. And so, like I said in the very beginning, I am just one of many, but I do love what I do.
Well, we need you to love what you do, and we need you to do what you do because you're making real change. So thank you. Thank you for doing it. And thank you for being here.
Yeah, you are so welcome.
Where can people follow along right now? How can they go change their lives?
The easiest place is Instagram. I'm there at Environmental Toxins Nerd. There is a ton of information there. People can go check out my website, which is just my name, laraadler.com. If someone is a health professional of any kind, come check out my courses. This is who I'm working to educate. Instagram is for everybody. My courses are really for those that are wanting to integrate this discussion into their businesses in some way. And those are the two main places where people will find me. I'm on Instagram every day.
Yes. And you're giving away such amazing free advice and information. So definitely go give Lara a follow, and I will put links to everything in the show notes along with her TapScore affiliate link. Let's give her some love for giving us all this awesome information. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for listening to Be Well by Kelly. Please subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Learn more at bewellbykelly.com and follow me on Instagram at bewellbykelly. I would love if you picked up my books, Body Love and Body Love Every Day. They're sold on Amazon and at all major booksellers.